members, right? And I'm not going to go through the whole discourse now because it's extremely volatile discourse, but normative whiteness, again, which I've erased, normative whiteness. Normative whiteness has been placed on the Hispanic community, and Argentinians are fairly light, if not whiter than maybe even most whites. So Argentinians might be at the height of the Hispanic community because of their whiteness, and indigenous populations and Mexicans are blacker, and they have been demonized, right? So it's the same template, right? The template, it's a cookie cutter idea. There's nothing novel about the concept, right? Those who are lighter, those who are whiter are better. So the Hispanic community adopts and has been colonialized to ascribe to this belief, and they impose that belief, arguably some say, on themselves. And the Chicano experience is at the bottom, yet again, right? And the point is, since the Chicano experience is at the bottom, those of us who share similar demonization, dehumanization need to come together, which is why I take great effort in recognizing and giving voice to the Chicano experience. I've with a friend of mine and an activist that I met during the HR 4437 protests throughout the United States a while ago, wrote a bit and published throughout the blogosphere, and wrote extensively on this notion of the junkiados, right? Junkiados. It's Jonkeados. The junkiados, right? And I want to talk a little bit about the notion of the junkiados. And you can read some of the stuff that I've written on, and it wasn't just me, it was myself, my friend Chioki Ayensen, and an activist, Mary Bell Gonzalez. She was actually part of the HR 4437 protest, and we worked as a graduate student. I worked closely with her and my other friends to give voice to the plight of the attempted finalization of Mexican identity. And I'll talk about that a little bit. But I want to talk about this notion of the junkiados. And this is a citation from stuff that I've already published. So, quote, "The danger with the conception of the junkiados is that industrialized countries perpetuate a myth of defective people." So the idea of the junkiados is an idea of defective people. Right? These Mexican people, the Chicano, the Chicana people, they're defective people. They're not as good as me. They're worse than black people. They're worse than the worst people, right? The Mexican laborers are as bad as they come, right? So and I didn't invent the concept junkiados. It exists, but what I'm doing is I'm incorporating, and I'm trying to let the rest of the community recognize the notion, the concept of the junkiados, to incorporate it into the Chicano experience of their subordination, so that the idea of junkiados is imposed on an individual, right? This concept relates to a person, and the question becomes, how does that person then identify him or herself if their identification is one of being defective? Just as a product is defective, so too are individual human beings defective. An individual's value is only recognized insofar as the individual performs to the expectations of her position. If she fails to meet those expectations, she immediately loses her value to the company. So that the only way you arrive at value is by supply and demand. Mexican laborers are faced with the threat of defective identities, right? So we then take this idea of defective products and we transplant that concept of defective products onto the collective identity of a group, and now we can talk about defective groups. And we justify the defect of this group by their inability to do what it is that they need to do, work, right? Your inability to work harder, to work more, to work for less makes you defective. And obviously we exploit this population of people, right? If they fail to meet the expectation of their positions, and after quitting or being fired from their jobs, they are faced with the psychological tortures of identifying themselves as defective, as failures, as defective human beings. And for me, this is in part a consequence of the felonization of the Chicano identity. And again, I've written extensively on HR 4437 with others and activists throughout the U.S. And all the links are there, so you can go read that stuff at your own time. But there's also the identification requirements in the Arizona law SB 1070, right? So if you take HR 4437 and then you add the Arizona law SB 1070, right? This results in the felonization of Chicana identity, right? This law plus this law or this House resolution plus this law, for me, arguably, is the attempt to felonize the identity of the Chicano individual. Just by on sight, the presence of an individual is a potential felony. Why? And for other reasons, I'm not going to get into all of that. There are pros and cons to this. I incorporated the first enforcement policy, and this is a direct quote from Arizona government page, and I've established links for you as well. Quote, requires a reasonable attempt to be made to determine the immigration status of a person during any legitimate contact made by an officer or agency of state or county, city or town, or political subdivision, if reasonable suspicion exists that the person is an alien who is unlawfully present in the United States. Now there's pros and cons to that, right? So opponents to SB 1070 argue against, obviously, racial profiling, right? I would take it a step further. The step further isn't that it's just not the case that it's racial profiling. The reasonable attempt to be made, right? What is that the language in there is extremely vague. A reasonable attempt to be made is extremely subjective language, right? So the question becomes, if you look like you are Chicano, if you look like you are Chicana, you might be here in the United States illegally. If you are in the United States illegally, that is a felon. You are committing a felony. Thus, your identity, the existence of you as a human being, is inherently felonized, right? So with respect to Chicano studies, the Chicano experience, there's something that not even the black experience has, right? We don't have that. There's a level of oppression that exists within the Chicano identity that African Americans cannot make sense of. This doesn't happen for black Americans. It might be the case that you see me and I'm tatted up and I'm in a wife beater listening to loud music, and you might, oh, he might be a criminal, right? You'd be surprised. But it's another thing to have someone have the legal justification to verify my immigration status based on how I look, right? That's a total different circumstance. So those against the tenets in SB 20 argue against racial profiling. I take it a step further and say the felonization of the Chicano identity. Those who support SB 1070 argue that the U.S. government isn't protecting its borders, right? Which is obviously true, right? There's only so much that the government does. Our borders, 450,000 illegal immigrants are rushing into border states. Millions and millions of illegal immigrants live in the United States now. So there is a problem. Who's right? I'm not here to debate who's right. I let the pundits debate who's right. What I'm here to do is give you the sort of totality of the argument. Those for SB 1070 are saying, listen, we need to protect our borders. Those against it say that it is a felonization, potentially, of the Chicano identity, which has huge theoretical impact. The next is theoretical components for 21st century race theory, and this comes again from Winnet. And I'm going to go through this sort of quickly. We must address the comparative historical dimensions of race. Right? We have to, and I talked about that. Right? And this is Winnet's account of racial formation theory. The next is we have to link, as I said before, micro and macro level aspects for racial signification and racialized social structures. We have to link the personal, phenomenological, existential experience with the collective identity of the group. Rather than homogenizing and generalizing, what we need to do is we need to really get good at our grounded theory and our coding and talk about themes that are resilient within the population. There's a way to do that. And again, I have videos on how that's done. And then lastly, recognition of the newly pervasive forms of politics, right? We have to recognize how political discourse unfolds with respect to racial identity. And then I want to end with just this quote approach to the racial formation theory, quote, "It views the meaning of race and the content of racial identities as usable and politically contested. It understands racial formation as the intersection conflict of racial projects that combine representational discursive elements with structural institutional ones. It sees these intersections as iteratives, sequences of interpretations, articulations of meaning of race that are open to many types of agency, from the individual to the organizational, from the local to the global." Right? So my attempt in this discourse on race, and albeit a very sort of brief crash course, was to articulate the origins of race, the attempt to reduce those biased, racist, scientific discourse to something that is empirically verifiable, and then to look in West sense the nihilism that exists undeniably within the community, for people who feel worthless, people who feel no lack of appreciation or love, to look at how tenets of subordination and domination not only affect members of the black community, but the Chicano and Chicana community as well, and how members in that community have an even more heinous level of oppression insofar as their identity is a condition for legal felonization, right? And the legal justification for the identification of their immigration status, for better or worse. I know it's a complicated discussion. So with that, I want to conclude my crash course in race theory. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.